This is True East. I'm Doron Spielman, and today we are talking about the return of the Abraham Accords. President Trump put it bluntly. Really great countries want to join the Abraham Accords after the Iran war. He said that Iran was the primary problem. Now with Iran's nuclear program in tatters and its deterrence completely shattered, the Middle East is entering a new phase. In fact, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff added, "We're working on normalization across an array of countries that maybe people would have never contemplated would come in." And that's what we're going to do today. We are going to contemplate what was once unthinkable, maybe even unthinkable a month ago. What countries are next? What stand in the way? And has Israel's strike on Iran helped or surprisingly possibly hurt the momentum? In order to do this, and I can't do it alone, I'm joined by my dear friend and the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish News Syndicate JNS, Alex Traiman. He's a leading voice on Israeli politics and U.S. Israel relations. Hello, my friend. Welcome,
Hey,
Alex.
It's good to be here.
Nice to be here in your studio.
It's your studio today.
Okay, it's my studio today. I'm a little bit nervous here with the patron.
I'm nervous too.
Okay, there we go. So we're fair. Alex, we're in a post-Iran world. Something's changed. I don't even know if we can grasp the entire change. And there's different tremors that are actually out there. In fact, I'm going to look here and tell you, we just had Congressman just before I came on, Zach Noon, who just said Israel just became a victim of its own success. And I think what he means by that is Israel carried out maybe the most brave and courageous aerial strike in any foreign country in the history of the world, with U.S. help on the 12th day. And perhaps Gulf states are looking. What do you think he could possibly mean? How could our success have become our undoing?
Well, maybe people always want to show that Israel's a victim in some way or another, but I don't think Israel's a victim of its success at all. I think that success is going to breed more success. Israel is emerging as a superpower in the region. Quite frankly, I think Israel's emerging into a global superpower. Not that it's a global military superpower. Its military is still limited in terms of what it can do, but you see just by all the attention that the actions of the state of Israel get, every country in the world is concerned about what Israel is doing because they see Israel as a moral superpower. Whether you're on Israel's side or you're not, everybody still recognizes that the global agenda is in many ways shaped by actions that take place here in Israel and the Middle East.
So do you think, looking, let's say, at Israel's immediate surroundings, Syria, Lebanon, UAE, Saudi Arabia, for instance, when they see Israeli might, and as you're saying, we've emerged as a moral superpower and a superpower on some level with U.S. support, by the way, coming in and just, hitting the final blow, but seeing what Israel did. Do you think that this scares them?
I don't think people are scared by that. Israel's been emerging for decades and has proven itself to be an emerging force in this region. Having the backing of the United States, that might be temporary. It wasn't that clear that Israel had this type of backing under the Biden administration, certainly not under the Obama administration. It did have it in that first Trump administration. I think everybody can see very clearly now, even though everybody was doubting it for weeks leading up to this Iran attack, that the United States and Israel are functioning as well as any two allies could possibly be functioning right now. That's definitely to Israel's short-term advantage. It's to the Middle East short-term advantage, but it will be critical both for Israel and the countries around the region to work now with the Trump administration to create foundations that will strengthen the Middle East and Israel's relations with the entire region, even beyond a Trump administration, because quite frankly, we don't know what's coming next.
Right. It could be next. We could get worse. We could get worse than anything we've ever had.
And it could get worse because the pendulum could swing back to the left, and we see what's going on in the progressive circles and who were running the key elements of the administrations in the State Department and Defense Department under the Democrats and under the Biden administration and Obama administrations. But we also see this turn on the right, this so-called isolationist fringe, which I think really doesn't understand the importance that Israel gives to the importance of that Israel provides the United States as part of this alliance.
So, if I kind of boil down to what you're saying, I want us to unpack this throughout this show. And what I want us to do is I want us to think about Who possibly are those people that Witkoff and Trump are referring to, these countries that might join the alliance? If I understand what you're saying, there's an enormous amount at stake, Alex. It's like there's almost like a clock ticking on the Abraham Accords because after Trump, we don't know. We could end up with an isolationist right. We could end up with a New York City mayor who's anti-Israel that's all of a sudden been promoted with AOC to a major and this may be the opportunity to lock in an alliance that may have to withstand years of uncertainty.
Well, we saw that the president broke all conventions to broker the Abraham Accords, which was the best kept secret in the entire world. I mean, look at all the leaks of the last several weeks about what's going on inside the Israeli administration, inside the Trump administration. Nobody leaked anything about the Abraham Accords. Like year in the news, we didn't even know about it to the day that it was announced. That was incredible. But he broke decades of conventions. You remember the four no's of John Kerry when asked if Israel could ever have normalization or peace with any of the countries in the Middle East before solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Kerry said no, 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 and sure enough, Trump came with the four yeses, which were the four normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. So he already understood that. The Palestinians should not have a veto on peace in the Middle East. He understood that the other countries in the region recognize that the Palestinians have delivered them nothing over these last decades. They've sucked billions of dollars and they have impeded progress in the region. Um, and so these countries were willing to sort of bypass, sideline, isolate the Palestinian Authority and move forward these normalization agreements. And in fact, that was what led Iran and its network of terror proxies in the region to really fast forward their attack on Israel. They were actually trying, and they said as much, to prevent normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which everybody had been talking about for months leading up to October 7th. And they understanding that if Saudi Arabia, which is the seat of global Islam, especially Sunni Islam, of course, but the seat of Islam would normalize relations with the Jewish state. It would essentially be the end of the greater Arab-Israeli conflict. They didn't want to see that, so they advanced their attack specifically to try to prevent this normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
So now I want you to put the Saudi Arabia name up on lights, and I want to take us forward in a week. President Trump has just invited Prime Minister Netanyahu to come to the Oval Office, to come to the White House, to sit with them for what they say is going to perhaps be major announcements. I mean, we're hearing major announcement. We're not really sure what they are. You've been in the Oval Office before, right? I think you were there last time that Prime Minister Netanyahu was with President Trump. You were in the Oval Office. Am I correct?
Yeah, for about an hour during an extended press conference with the two leaders.
So conceivably, if that happens again, you may be there again. I don't know the lineup. I want you to take us there for 1 second. Bring all of us into the Oval Office in a week with you. If there's an announcement, do you think that Saudi Arabia may be one of those countries?
It's possible. We really don't know what's going to be announced next week. On the one hand, there's talks of major diplomatic announcements. We know that there's still the war that continues to rage in the Gaza Strip, and I think that Israeli leaders are looking for a way to swiftly conclude this war. Of course, that means a deal that would get back all of the remaining hostages, living and dead. Uh, there are other countries that are been discussing different arrangements, whether normalization or security arrangements with Israel, be it Syria, potentially Lebanon. But we've also heard that security is not completely stabilized here in Israel. And you mentioned that Iran was over before. The story's not over. The military operation is complete. The military operation was a stunning success. The story of Iran is not finished. The regime is still in place. It is a severely wounded tiger right now. And the question is, will we see a regime change? Will we see this regime strengthen itself? Will they try to rebuild? Will they rush towards some kind of crude nuclear weapon? Do they have some other way of acquiring a nuclear weapon? We don't know what the end of the story with Iran is going to be. Um, we also know that the prime minister had asked for a 2-week delay in his trial, and we can talk about Trump's tweets regarding Netanyahu's trial separately. But the court didn't want to grant this 2-week delay in the trial. They said, "Look, you were undergoing trial during the war, so we don't see any reason why you can't sit on trial now too. Now we see that Trump was just has just invited Netanyahu to fly to Washington. So certainly, if Netanyahu is going to Washington, that's a good reason
They
to.
they won't continue the trial on the plane.
But what we did see is that in order to convince the court that a 2 week delay in the trial was warranted, Netanyahu, for the first time, brought his military secretary, chief of staff, I believe, just heads of the security establishment to the court to present to them national security reasons why it would be imprudent for Netanyahu to sit in his trial over these next 2 weeks. So that might tell us that there could be more military operations, people wondering if there's going to be some kind of a military operation involving Yemen. We know the Houthis are still firing
Yes, they
ballistic
are.
missiles at Israel. People aren't talking about it too much, but there's a growing sense in the security establishment here that the situation in Egypt might be becoming less and less stable, with the Egyptians militarizing the Sinai Peninsula, both with tanks, but also I heard for the first time that there are ballistic missiles being positioned in the Sinai pointed at Israel, which represents an existential security threat. So we don't really know exactly what are going to be the announcements here. Part of it's going to be a victory lap, of course, over the successful Operation Rising Lion and the coordinated Operation Midnight Hammer, um, where Trump dropped 14 GBU 57 MOP bunker busters,
The
30,000.
mother of all bombs, to sum
Well,
it
it's
up.
not the Moab, but it's the mop, and it cleans up the mess underground. So there's going to be a bit of a victory lap, but I do think there'll be announcements, and it's everybody should buckle their seatbelts. I think what's coming is exciting. I do know that the president has a greater vision for the Middle East, as does the prime minister, than just attacking the Iranian nuclear facilities.
You know, going into right now, the eyes of the Arab world are going to be looking in that Oval Office in the White House, which again, hopefully you'll be in, and JNS will be bringing us the news as soon as it comes out firsthand, which I think is incredible to show how this news agency has really, just as a side note, just been transformed from really getting going well after many of the other news agencies to achieving such prominence. And I say that not only because I'm affiliated and proud to be here, but because the news that's coming out of JNS is so apt. But everyone's going to be logged down looking, Alex. And what I've heard is that possibly Saudi Arabia, now that Iran is deterred, they are deterred whether they can rebuild in 4 months or 4 years. And they're not going to rebuild where they were again in 4 months. It's just that's an impossibility, but it could be years. They're deterred for the time being. Maybe some of the pressure is off Saudi Arabia to rush to a deal. And I was hoping maybe you could shed light on that. And also, from their eyes, do you think they understand that the US and Israel were totally coordinated? Because it seemed for a few weeks like maybe we weren't.
I would say not only do they understand that Israel and the United States were totally coordinated, but I would even venture on to say that Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia were totally coordinated.
Wow. Okay. That's
Um,
big, Alex. That's big. You think they were perhaps party to this?
First, even if you look back to the Abraham Accords agreements, there's no way that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain would have normalized relations with Israel without the explicit blessing of the Saudis. Okay, they've been part of this process for a long time. It's their vision of modernizing the Middle East. And if you want to take a look at a country that was considered to be an extremist country not too long ago, but has taken steps towards modernization, I don't want to say all of a sudden that they're like a beacon of human rights and a democracy. That's not the case, but they've taken a lot of steps toward economic modernization and towards a certain degree of westernization. And the president appreciates that. He sees that they're the biggest landmass in the Middle East as well. There's a greater economic vision that the president has. But I think that there's important strategic consideration here, specifically with regard to what comes after a Trump administration and also what came before a Trump administration. You can depend right now on the United States to be engaged in the Middle East, to correct some of the malevolent behavior of the previous administrations, the
that cut ties at one point and cold-shouldered
Not just with the Saudis.
and hand-bumped.
Right. That, we know about the Biden administration, how they handled the Khashoggi affair, and how they really were trying to shame the Saudis and distance them, but also how they disengaged from the rest of the region, and also how they funded Iran. Remember how the Obama administration removed support from Hosni Mubarak, who was considered to be a relatively stable dictator in Israel, and gave wind to the Muslim Brotherhood to take over that country. Everybody in the Middle East understands what could happen. And if you cannot rely on the United States to be uh, the protectorate of the region, to be the one that maintains law and order, to be the one that's going to operate against direct threats to regional security, if the United States is not going to be that power, who is going to be that power? And now I think Israel has a lot of credibility with their attack on Iran, whereby other countries in the region understand that Israel is finally growing into itself as a power. It understands the power of its military. It understands what are its own existential threats and its own existential interests, and knows that it will act on those interests. And therefore, if the United States cannot prove to be a reliable ally for the long term, they need to link up with a reliable ally. And Israel is not as powerful as the United States, but in terms of the Middle East, is proving to be as powerful as any ally can be.
And that we're showing that we will directly address a threat even on the other side of these countries. I mean, again, people often forget that Iran via the Houthis attacked Saudi Arabia, severely attacked Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia issued kind of like a symbolic attack back, but there was no response. Israel is now operating on the far side of Saudi Arabia, on the far side of the Emirates, dealing with an enemy that directly attacks them.
Let's forget the direct threat of Iran to the state of Israel, or the direct attacks and the ballistic missiles. The Iranians destabilized the entire region. They destabilized Iraq. They completely destabilized Syria. They completely destabilized Lebanon. They obviously destabilized Gaza. They destabilized Yemen, and the Houthis were attacking Saudi Arabia from Yemen. They are a direct threat to every player in the region. And it's not only the attacks on the nuclear facilities that I think impresses the Saudis and the other players in the region, but it's how Israel methodically filed down each one of these major terror proxies, which were the Iranian strategy to destabilize the whole region. Hamas is nothing compared to what it was prior to October 7th. Hezbollah has been degraded 75 to 80% of what it once was before October 7th. They've been degraded and deterred so much that when Iran and Israel were engaged in this 12-day war, Hezbollah didn't fire one single missile or rocket at Israel. And that was Iran's whole strategy, to try to deter an attack by Israel, was the threat of Hezbollah.
They were hoping 500, at least 500 a day. Yeah.
And
from Hezbollah.
There wasn't one in 12 days.
So if with all this, so Saudi Arabia is looking for some type of solid ally to help them in the long term, not knowing exactly where things are going in the Middle East, to deal with local threats, and that could open the door to potential peace deal. What about their insistence, even most recently, that is predicated on a Palestinian state? Is that just, trying to appease the Saudi street? Is Bibi going to be able to deal with that by saying, that he's got some hope for a Palestinian state, or is there going to be a real push for an independent Palestinian state?
Well, like you said earlier, the Saudis in their public statements, you didn't necessarily support an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, right? Now, on the one hand, that's because they were trying to project to the Iranians that they didn't support it, even though, as I mentioned to you, they are pretty much coordinated with Israel and the United States on what was going to happen. Maybe they didn't know the specific hour that the strike was going to take place, but I am certain that they understood what these two countries were planning, and wanted those two countries, Israel and America, to do what they did. At the same time, we see the Saudis stating over and over again that they would like to see some pathway toward Palestinian statehood. Now, there's a problem, and there's a problem with the problem. The problem is that they say that their street is not ready to have the Saudi leadership abandon the Palestinians, and the street doesn't really like Israel that much. You have the same problem in Egypt. You have the same problem in Jordan. The problem with the problem is when you keep reinforcing the street, then you never bring your your population along. And that's why the Jordanian people hate Israel. That's why the Egyptian public hates Israel, even as the leaderships of Jordan and Egypt understand the value of working together with Israel. So you don't have like a sea change in the entire region until you have the leadership bucking the old talking points and saying, "Listen, we know what we said. The Palestinians, they really haven't given us much of anything over these last decades. Israel offers us a lot. We might not love everything about them. We don't love their religion. We might not even like that they came here, but they are here. And since they're here, and since we can't really defeat them in war, and we have no aspirations of defeating them in a war, it's better to work with them." And that's the type of messaging that we want to start hearing. We'll have to see. Perhaps that will happen after some kind of agreement, but more important than that, I think it's important to look at the economic incentives that the Trump administration may be offering countries in order to normalize with Israel. It's not just a straight up Israel Saudi deal. You guys decided to shake hands and make up. That's great. There's a lot of incentives that the Trump administration may be willing to provide in terms of military equipment, in terms of other economic incentives. And there's this important trade corridor that the president of the United States is trying to advance that begins in India. It's called the IMEC corridor. It starts in India, goes through the Middle East, it goes through Saudi Arabia, it comes up through Israel, and then connects onto Europe, which is an alternative in the president's eyes to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Um, that bypasses choke points like the Suez Canal, which the Houthis effectively blocked for nearly the last 2 years. Um, and so the Saudis see it in their direct economic interest of being a pillar in this corridor. And they understand that Israel is another pillar in this corridor, and that the benefits of having this cooperation could transcend just cultural and security considerations.
I want us to now apply what you just said about the street to a new street, a street that's emerged very, very recently with new leadership. Very suddenly, it's only 3 months old, which is Syria. You have new leadership in Syria, Al Sharia. You've got a street that I don't know if we actually had a sense of who they were for decades because of the incredibly harsh military rule of the Assad regime, which we saw, of course, all the way down to perhaps concentration camps. And we now see a new street emerging, and we now see a new regime emerging. The U.S. just lifted sanctions, so talk about economic incentives. There's a lot of talk that maybe we're going to see something positive out of Syria long term. Yet at the same time, we're hearing that we can't agree over the Golan Heights. What's your crystal ball say on Syria, Israel? Do you think there's a real chance, and could we see it in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think there's a chance because the president of the United States has agreed to lift sanctions on a country that's been under harsh sanctions for a very long time, since the bitter civil war that was being fought uh, inside Syria. Now, the president is looking around the region, and we can look back at the president's trip. He went to Saudi Arabia, he went to Qatar, he met with Al Julani, also known as Al Shara, um, the new head of Syria in Saudi Arabia. And people were asking, what's the president doing? He's accepting a jet from Qatar. We know that the Qataris are funding the American universities, that they were housing Hamas leadership. Yeah, I don't think anybody thinks that the Qataris are
They fund Hamas
exactly
and Hezbollah.
right. Nobody thinks that the Qataris are like beacons of peace and democracy in the region. And certainly with Syria, I mean, Al Jolani, he's got deep connections to Al Qaeda. That's his past. And there's not really any good reason to assume that he suddenly changed his ideology. But maybe he's become a little bit more practical, and he recognizes that if he wants to be able to succeed in running his country long term, that he needs to be able to bring capital into the country, and you can't bring capital into the country if the United States is putting sanctions. Not to mention that if Israel is going to take out Iran, you can't even look to Iran for support. The Russians were basically pushed out of there as well, and they're busy with Ukraine. So there's nobody offering al-Shara a lifeline except for the president of the United States.
And Turkey, to be fair.
Well, Turkey, but they also have their own economic issues. They're not necessarily like a reliable economic power. And if Turkey is going to be the dominant backer, then you're still going to have the American sanctions. So yeah, the president is looking at Qatar. He's looking at Syria. He's looking at the region. He said, "Look, we're taking out Iran, which is the main source of instability. That creates a vacuum of leadership. So either we can come in very quickly and fill that vacuum, or we can let the vacuum continue to percolate and see where the chips fall. If the president of the United States puts sanctions on Syria, if keeps sanctions on Syria, if the president of the United States puts sanctions on Qatar, which I think a lot of people, including the Israelis, might have suggested, he says, where do the Qataris go? They're going to go into the China Russia axis. And as somebody who has done business with Qatar, and as the president has, as Jared Kushner has, as Steve Witkoff has, they're looking and saying, hey, we know how to do business with these guys. And we're hedging that they value their ability to do business with Europe and the United States more than they value their relationship with Iran, which we've just degraded and humiliated. So the president is hoping that by giving the economic incentives that he can pull these countries back into the American orbit. And the model for that is the Saudis. The Saudis have moderated their behavior. So that's why it's important for the president that Syria come into the Saudi orbit, and that is connected to the United States. And because the president is giving so much money to Syria, so the president has a lot of leverage. And Syria, without any military, remember, Israel destroyed the entirety of the Syrian military immediately in the days after the fall of Bashar Assad. So Syria's in no place to attack Israel. So if they have no capability to attack Israel and they want to stay in the good graces of the United States, Al-Shar will make the pragmatic decision that it might be best to normalize relations to a certain extent with the state of Israel.
Alex, I want to jump far north and then I want to jump to the other side of the world. And then I want to jump back home and talk about Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu and Trump's recent statements. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. These are two countries that most people don't even understand or know about. They border Russia. They're not that far from China. They have had ongoing trade relations. I don't know if most people understand this with Israel. We get much of our gas, a very large percentage of our gas from Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. You and I were both at a conference not that long ago where there were Kazakhstani people at the conference that were speaking about oil, about the government. Israel's incredibly close. Um, there's an advantage there because we already had diplomatic relations, but it could be maybe that we're going to see them coming, that they may be one of the first ones to get involved.
Well, I think it's important for Israel and for the president of the United States to just build momentum. And if you start to see like Muslim majority countries normalize relations with Israel, even if they're not on the borders with Israel, it just sends the signal that this train has left the station and that it's more and more acceptable to have normalization with Israel. And if you really think about it, the amazing thing is that the Obama administration, the Biden administration, what they sought to do was isolate Israel, specifically with the Europeans, and that's still a big problem, by the way. We're losing support in much of Western Europe, although we still have some incredible support in places like Hungary and Czech Republic and Poland. I was with the prime minister when he met Viktor Orban in Hungary, and it's incredible to see how that relationship is developing. But the president is trying to undo it, and he's also trying to make the Western Europeans look foolish because if the Saudis and Syria and Lebanon and all these other Muslim majority countries are saying, hey, we don't have a problem with Israel anymore, then why do the Western Europeans have a problem with Israel?
That's interesting. So it's flipping the lens to more marginalizing the European ideology. Plus, he's also giving the Europe a serious kick in the tuchus. I mean, they're committing now 5% of their annual budgets, to defense for the first time.
Right. And Israel is a country that spends more than 5% of GDP on its defense and actually puts its troops and its planes and all of its military to use when it's threatened. So Israel's a great model that America can point to with regard to these countries in the European Union. Like, hey, why don't you just be like Israel is? But when you also understand the IMEC corridor that begins in India, comes through the Middle East, connects via Israel as a major hub, the goods then go on to Europe, via Cyprus, potentially extending on to Italy, potentially even extending on to France. And again, this is an alternative to the Chinese trade routes. So it's really going to be in European interest to protect stability in the Middle East. And if Israel's a critical hub in that trade route, then they're going to really have no choice but to stop this whole concept of putting economic sanctions on Israel, because it's gonna harm them economically as well.
I want us now, Alex, to jump to the largest Muslim country in the world. Okay, we're going to leap across the world. It's the fourth largest population in the entire world, and that is Indonesia, a place that most people don't understand, haven't really even heard about, and it is the by far and away the largest Muslim country in the world. There are hundreds of millions of Muslims living in Indonesia. There are far more Muslims in the world than there are Muslim Arabs in the world, and Indonesia is the biggest core. Israel's had an ongoing trade. We don't talk about it that much, but there's been ongoing trade of tens of millions of dollars on an annual basis. Even Yitzhak Rabin in 1993 visited Indonesia. It's there was expressed before October 7th that all of a sudden there was a secret was released in all of the press that Israel's going to be forming into a peace agreement with Indonesia via the Abraham Accords, and then it kind of disappeared. And I'm wondering if when we hear right now about who's going to be leading this type of announcement that could bring in other countries, if it's not maybe the unexpected giant of Indonesia, of hundreds of millions of Muslims that are not Arab, that don't have a direct issue with Israel, that have a massive influence on trade, and that are also cornered kind of by China, obviously very close to China. There's a buffer with Russia. And as you talk about the Indo corridor, they could be a major, major ally. So I'm throwing that out there. What do you think?
Well, it's going to have to be somebody. I think that the dominoes are going to start to fall. We don't know who's going to be first. Syria, uh, Saudi. Saudi's definitely, I think, an important player, and it's been considered by the prime minister to be the crown jewel of any kind of a normalization. To the extent that the prime minister told me, and the eve of the last election, I asked him. I said, "What do you want to accomplish in a next term, another term that you haven't accomplished already in all these other terms?" He said two things. One is preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons once and for all. The second is expanding the circle of peace and normalizing with Saudi Arabia. But Indonesia could potentially be that first player, and maybe there's less penalty on Indonesia from their own street for normalizing with Israel, specifically just because they've never been in direct conflict with Israel. They're not part of the neighborhood, so maybe a little bit easier for it to begin over there and work its way back to Israel. But I think you're seeing that this entire range of the Muslim world that goes starts all the way to the west in Morocco, which is already normalized with Israel, to these nations that are directly surrounding Israel. Um, Lebanon and Syria, you already have peace to a certain extent, and we could talk about that for another whole show with Jordan and Egypt, but the Saudis, and then it can extend, all the way through. We have the Emirates, we have Bahrain, there could be Oman, it could be Iraq, it could be Kuwait, and it could go all the way to Indonesia.
It's amazing, Alex. I feel like when talking with you, I see this map in front of my eyes. And first of all, your grasp of the entire map is tremendous. And this opportunity for Israel, led by President Trump to a large degree. And, this is a historic time. When we talk about Koresh, who was the leader of ancient Persia, and people have been quipping for years, oh, Trump is like Koresh. Koresh reestablished Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel 2,500 years ago. I can't think of another person that's had such a vision for Israel and the Middle East and whose positivity and seeing this almost, really just smushes the voices that have constantly tried to hold this back, whether it's because of an obsession with giving a terror supporting Palestinian population a state or whether it's trying to marginalize us. I feel like listening to you and hearing this, we're going to see in 2 weeks. And I almost think we should come back to the show based on what we're saying. Something's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be Saudi Arabia first, Syria, Lebanon, whether it's going to be Indonesia, which is kind of the dark horse in this, but it could be them. But something very big seems like it's going to happen.
Well, I'd like to say I think it's really been Prime Minister Netanyahu's vision for the greater Middle East, and I believe that he and his deputy, Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who was Israel's former ambassador to the United States and is the one responsible for maintaining relations with the United States, both with friendly administrations and with unfriendly administrations. They've done an amazing job working with Trump and with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman and with Jared Kushner on presenting this big vision and then maintaining that close relationship and understanding that it's not just a dream, that there are specific steps that you need to take in order to facilitate and implement this dream. And they're doing that. And I think that the president is a visionary. I do believe that he adapted this vision and thought to himself, what can I offer these countries to make this vision a reality? But the other thing is he understands how it benefits the United States. And I think that ultimately Trump, he's not the czar of the Middle East. He's not the prime minister of Israel. He's the president of the United States. And what he's trying to do is improve the economic condition of the United States. And in order to do that, because he really does view America as the world's greatest superpower and maybe the greatest country in the history of mankind. In order to maintain that position, you have to support your allies. You have to oppose your enemies. You have to be able to flex your military might so that nations of the world know not to mess with you, nor to mess with your allies. And he's doing that. So I think that this is very much within the American interest, what the president's doing. I think that all these supposed isolationists that are saying America first, I mean, America first, if it means America only, and let's only worry about what's going on domestically, when America's only focused on what's going on domestically, what do you see? You see Putin attacking Ukraine. You see China threatening Taiwan. You see Iran threatening the entire Middle East and attacking Israel. If you're not focused on what's going on in the rest of the world and you're not willing to flex your muscles to maintain law and order across the globe, you're not going to be that great superpower that the people that claim that they're America first actually want America to be. I think the president understands that, and he's working towards that. And he sees Israel in particular as a great ally in helping him achieve his economic and security vision.
Beautiful, Alex. I take that and I take that point very much to heart because I actually said Trump first, but you're correct. This is homegrown, and you actually just made me think of a story which I wrote about in the book, which is years ago. I actually had an insight into what you're saying about Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ron Dermer, which is when we were digging in the city of David years ago, and this is something they never ever got credit for. And we had reached the underground foundation stones of the Temple Mount. And I explained this in the book. And there was an enormous amount of fear that the Obama administration, if they heard that the city of David was connected via an underground tunnel to the Temple Mount, given everything that they had done about isolating Israel, that they would completely blow this up, could actually ignite a war in Israel with the Arab countries and would use this against us. And it was when we crawled through that tunnel with Ron Dermer that he spoke to the prime
And he's
minister.
not a little guy, by the way.
He's a big guy, and he was wearing a suit, by the way, the Ron Dermer very nice suit with the red tie, and we wrapped him up in a white, smock, so to speak. It looked like we were going in a reactor near an Iranian reactor, and when he came out, he said, "I'm gonna speak to the prime minister," and he called the day later, and they never got credit for this. He said, "Do it quietly. It's totally legal. Do it quietly." But the prime minister says, "You have to do this because of its historical importance." And a lot of what you're saying, I was almost laughing at myself for having mentioned Trump first when there really is a strength to him and Ron Dermer, I think, that has been around for decades. And there's a vision, there's a concept of Israeli history, Jewish history. And what I'm getting from you in this discussion is this incredible vision that after we've come out of the ghetto and spent years hiding, and we've come into the land of Israel and we've spent years fighting, I think you presented a vision of kind of rising above that and looking at a much brighter future. And you've brought that here so clearly, and I appreciate it. I want to ask you one last question. President Trump, in his recent tweets about Prime Minister Netanyahu, both on Truth Social and on X, and saying that this is a witch hunt, and why is he doing this? Is this like, and people are asking, is this a quid pro quo? What's going on?
Well, I think in part it's really to correct the misdeeds of previous administrations. I mean, if you look back all the way to the Clinton administration, I mean, I reported on this years ago. Bill Clinton openly acknowledged that he was doing everything in his power to make sure that Netanyahu would lose first to Shimon Peres and then later to Ehud Barak, who ended up defeating Netanyahu by a small margin. We know that the Obama administration was putting funds through the State Department, as well as all of his own political consultants, into an organization set up called V15, which was meant to assist now President Bougie Herzog, who at that time was running against Netanyahu as the head of the Labor Party, to assist them to try to beat Netanyahu. We still see all of the Democratic uh, political consultants aiding all of Netanyahu's political opponents, including most recently Benny Gantz. But we also saw after October 7th how the Biden administration, through its surrogates like Hillary Clinton, who was former Secretary of State and former presidential nominee, candidate rather, and then you had nominee actually, and then you had Chuck Schumer, who's always called himself the Shomer or the guardian of Israel and the Jewish people, openly calling for an election in Israel, saying these guys saying Netanyahu's got to go. The Israeli people need to decide again who should be their prime minister, even though we've had 5 elections in the last like 6.5 years. And Netanyahu, of all the people, of all world leaders, has won more elections, I think, than anybody in office today. The people keep picking over and over again that they want Netanyahu to be the prime minister. So they have just continuously tried to weaken Netanyahu's hold on the Israeli electorate, and certainly the Israeli court system and the prosecution have tried to weaken Netanyahu's hold. I mean, if you look at these cases, even when they just announced first they were going to investigate Netanyahu, when did they announce they were going to investigate Netanyahu? On the eve of the first election, so that the Israeli public would say, hey, if you want to vote for him, you're voting for somebody we think might be a criminal. And then before the next election, hey, oh, hey, just right before the election, yeah, we've decided we're going to formally indict Netanyahu. And by the way, always leaking pieces of evidence to the media during the election cycle, just to continue to harm Netanyahu's chances in the electorate. There's a good chance, by the way, that Netanyahu will be in an election soon. I mean, the next election is scheduled for less than a year and a half from now. I think it's highly likely that we get to an election within the next 12 months, maybe sooner. And I think Trump is making it known that he likes the Israelis' choice of Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister, would like to see Netanyahu unshackled, doesn't want the prime minister of the country to have to ask the court if he's allowed to go to Washington, especially when you see what these trials are all about and how they've fallen apart piece by piece during the trial. The court told the prosecution that they have no bribery case after they presented their case. Uh, there would have been many grounds for a mistrial here, but it's a circus, and the president, I think, coming to Netanyahu's aid. And I think one thing about the president and the prime minister, the special bond that they have, that I think maybe no two people on earth have, is that they both understand what it's like to be in the other's shoes. How many people really understand the politically motivated criminal prosecutions against President Trump, except for Netanyahu,
That's a very good point.
and vice versa? So there's a lot of respect there. You see that the working relationship is strategic, effective, and I think Trump just wants to see Israel flourish. And he believes that the best way for Israel to flourish is if the Israeli people do what they've done over and over again and back their prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Alex, this has been brilliant. You have really enlightened for me, and I'm sure for all of our listeners and our viewers, the lens of what is happening. And I think you said it best. And I'll say this to our incredible audience: that is awesome, as these last 2 weeks have been, and as really dramatic, and will go down in history of what Israel managed to do, really on its own, was willing to go off on its own and fight with its own fingernails and send its own planes for 11 days against an enemy that was 1,600 miles away, and we managed to deal them a devastating blow. What comes over the next 2 weeks may also go down in history, perhaps on the same level in terms of really the trajectory of Israel towards the future. You've heard it here on True East. It's a blessing to be joined by my dear colleague and patron, Alex Traiman, and the
And
CEO of
you're
Deterrence.
doing a great job here on True East, and I'm in the middle of your book right now, and it's incredible. So I urge people to read it. When the Stones Speak, it's a great read.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Keep up the good work.
I will. We'll let the stones speak, and we'll let the prime minister and the president speak, and hopefully the future, I'm sure, only has good things for us. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Doron.